August 14th, 1923, 11:47 p.m. Willie Johnson, 26 years old, older brother to 18-year-old Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, and survivor of the 1915 lynching attempt that had forced his parents to mortgage their Charleston home to send him north, made a decision that would cost him his life and trigger 3 days of retaliatory violence that would leave 7 white men dead and force federal investigators to close their files rather than confront what their investigation would reveal about police complicity in racial terrorism. Willie had been living in New York since he was 13 years old, arriving in 1915 after being accused of killing a white man in Charleston, an accusation that was never proven but that carried a death sentence in the Jim Crow South, where Negro boys could be lynched based on rumor alone. For 8 years, Willie had worked various jobs in Harlem and surrounding neighborhoods, learning to navigate the complex racial geography of New York City, understanding which streets were safe for Negro people and which boundaries should never be crossed. But Willie, who had survived one near lynching in the South and who had grown comfortable in the relative freedom of the North, made a fatal error in judgment that would remind him too late that racial boundaries existed everywhere in America, enforced not by law, but by organizations like the Ku Klux Klan, which had established chapters throughout New York City, and which viewed Negro presence in white neighborhoods as an existential threat requiring violent enforcement. Willie's fatal mistake was accepting an invitation from a white woman he had met while working as a porter at Pennsylvania Station. Catherine Murphy, 24 years old, daughter of Irish immigrants, worked as a secretary in Midtown Manhattan, and had developed what she convinced herself was merely a friendly acquaintance with the polite Negro porter who always greeted her cheerfully when she passed through the station. She had mentioned during one of their conversations that she lived in Washington Heights, a predominantly Irish and Jewish neighborhood on the northern edge of Manhattan that bordered Harlem but maintained strict racial separation through informal but rigidly enforced social codes. When Willie mentioned that he had lived in New York for 8 years but had never ventured into the Irish neighborhoods of Washington Heights, Catherine made an offhand remark, perhaps motivated by genuine friendliness or perhaps by the kind of casual rebelliousness that young white women sometimes exhibited toward racial conventions. They found arbitrary that he should visit the neighborhood sometime to see how different parts of Manhattan lived. Willie, interpreting this as a genuine invitation rather than mere polite conversation, decided on the evening of August 14th to walk from his apartment on 132nd Street up to Washington Heights to surprise Catherine at her home. He arrived at the Murphy family's apartment building on West 187th Street at 11:47 p.m., dressed in the same respectable suit he wore to work at the station, carrying a small bouquet of flowers he had purchased from a street vendor. He knocked on the apartment door. Catherine's father, Thomas Murphy, a construction foreman who had been a member of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan since the organization established its New York City chapter in 1921, opened the door to find a well-dressed Negro man holding flowers and asking to speak with his daughter. What happened in the next 3 minutes was later described by multiple witnesses who lived in the building, though none of them intervened to prevent what followed. Thomas Murphy, after recovering from his initial shock at finding a Negro at his door asking for his daughter, called for his 2 sons and for several neighbors who he knew, shared his membership in the local Clan Claiborne. Within 90 seconds, 6 white men had gathered in the hallway. Willie, finally understanding that he had walked into a trap of his own making, attempted to apologize and leave, explaining that he had misunderstood Mrs. Murphy's daughter's polite conversation as an invitation, but the men blocked his exit from the building. Catherine Murphy, hearing the commotion, appeared in the hallway and denied having invited Willie to visit, claiming that she had only engaged in polite conversation with him at the station and that he must have misunderstood her casual remarks as some kind of romantic interest. Whether this was true or whether Catherine was lying to protect herself from her father's rage is impossible to determine from the historical record, but her denial sealed Willie's fate. Thomas Murphy and his companions dragged Willie down 4 flights of stairs, beating him continuously as elderly Irish residents opened their doors to watch and then closed them again without calling police. The building's superintendent, who witnessed the abduction, later told investigators that he heard Thomas Murphy say that they were going to teach this uppity Negro what happened when colored boys forgot their place and tried to court white girls in white neighborhoods. The men forced Willie into a car waiting on the street. The car drove north into an undeveloped area near Fort Tryon Park, a wooded section of Upper Manhattan that was still largely rural in 1923. and that provided the kind of isolation necessary for what the Klan intended. At approximately 12:30 a.m. on August 10th, 1923, members of Claver No. 7 of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan New York City chapter burned Willie Johnson alive 8 years after his parents had sacrificed everything to save him from a similar fate in Charleston. The specific details of what happened during the 30 minutes before Willie died were later pieced together by investigators through witness testimony from 3 Negro men who worked as night laborers clearing land in the area and who heard Willie's screams from approximately 200 yards away. According to their statements, the screaming lasted between 20 and 25 minutes before stopping abruptly, and during those minutes they heard Willie calling out his brother's name, calling out for Bumpy, begging someone to help him. When police finally arrived at the scene 47 minutes after receiving an anonymous tip, they found Willie's charred remains tied to a tree surrounded by partially burned wooden crosses and Klan regalia that the perpetrators had apparently abandoned in their hasty retreat. The medical examiner later determined that Willie had been beaten severely before being doused with kerosene and set on fire while still conscious, and that he had died from a combination of smoke, inhalation, and thermal injuries that had consumed more than 70% of his body. Bumpy Johnson learned about his brother's death at 6:15 a.m. on August 15th, when 2 police detectives appeared at his apartment on 132nd Street to inform him that Willie had been found dead and that they needed someone to identify the body. Bumpy, who, at 18 years old, had already spent 5 years working as an enforcer for various Harlem numbers runners and street criminals, and who had developed a reputation for controlled violence and strategic thinking that made older criminals respect him despite his age, showed no emotional reaction when the detectives described how Willie had died. He listened to them explain that his brother had been burned alive, that his body had been found tied to a tree in Upper Manhattan, that there were signs suggesting Klan involvement. Bumpy asked only one question during the entire conversation. "Did he call my name?" The detectives, confused by the question, confirmed that witnesses had heard the victim calling for someone named Bumpy during the attack. Bumpy nodded once, accompanied them to the morgue, identified his brother's remains through physical details that had survived the fire, a scar on Willie's left hand from a childhood accident in Charleston, the specific shape of his feet, and then walked out of the building without asking the questions that the detectives expected. Questions about who had killed Willie and whether anyone would be arrested and whether the police had any leads. Bumpy understood something that the detectives apparently did not understand or chose not to acknowledge. The police were not going to arrest anyone for Willie's murder because the people who had killed him were members of the Ku Klux Klan, and because many police officers in New York City in 1923 were Klan members or Klan sympathizers, and because Negro lives had less value in the eyes of law enforcement than white lives, even in supposedly progressive northern cities. Willie had escaped lynching in Charleston in 1915 only to die the same way 8 years later in New York, and the system that was supposed to protect him had failed just as completely in the North as it had in the South. Bumpy walked from the morgue to the apartment where Willie had lived alone since 1920, a small studio on 134th Street that Willie had been proud to afford through his legitimate work at Pennsylvania Station. Bumpy sat in his dead brother's apartment for 3 hours, surrounded by Willie's few possessions, his work uniforms, his books, the letters he had received from their parents in Charleston, describing how proud they were that he had built a life in the North, how their sacrifice in 1915 had been worth it because Willie was safe. At 11 a.m. on August 15th, Bumpy left Willie's apartment and spent the next 3 hours conducting his own investigation through contacts he had developed during his 5 years in Harlem's criminal underworld. By 2 p.m., he had identified Thomas Murphy as the primary instigator of Willie's abduction and murder, had learned the names of 5 other white men who had participated in the killing, and had discovered through conversations with Negro workers who lived near Washington Heights that Claver No. 7 met every Tuesday night in the basement of a building on Broadway between 184th and 185th Streets that was owned by a member of the organization. Bumpy also learned through a contact who worked as a cleaning woman in a police precinct in Upper Manhattan that detectives investigating Willie's death had been ordered by their commanding officer not to pursue leads that might implicate Klan members, and that the official police position was that Willie had been killed by unknown assailants, and that the investigation would likely be closed within a week for lack of evidence. At 3:30 p.m. on August 15th, Bumpy met with William Hewlett, the Harlem gangster who employed him as an enforcer and who controlled several illegal gambling operations in the neighborhood. Bumpy explained what had happened to Willie and what he intended to do about it. Hewlett, who was 41 years old and who had been involved in organized crime since he was a teenager and who had known Willie Johnson since 1916 when Willie first started working odd jobs in Harlem, gave Bumpy permission to use whatever resources he needed from Hewlett's organization to carry out his retaliation. Hewlett also provided Bumpy with 5 men, all of them experienced criminals who were comfortable with violence, all of them willing to risk arrest or worse, to send a message that Harlem would not tolerate Klan violence against its residents, especially not against Willie Johnson, who had survived one lynching attempt as a boy only to die in another as a man. Together, Bumpy and these 5 associates spent the remainder of August 15th preparing for what would become 72 hours of systematic revenge that would terrorize Washington Heights' white population and demonstrate that racial violence could flow in both directions. The first target was Thomas Murphy. Bumpy's sources had provided detailed information about Murphy's daily routine, including the fact that he left his apartment every morning at 5:45 a.m. to catch a subway to a construction site in Brooklyn, where he worked as a foreman. On the morning of August 16th, Murphy left his apartment building as usual, walked 3 blocks to the subway station, and descended the stairs to the platform. He never made it onto the train. For Negro men, none of whom he recognized, and all of whom were waiting on the platform in positions that blocked any escape route, approached him simultaneously. What happened next was witnessed by approximately 30 commuters who were also waiting for the train, though later police interviews revealed that no witnesses could provide descriptions detailed enough to identify the attackers, beyond noting that they were Negro men in their late teens or early 20s wearing ordinary work clothes. The 4 men beat Thomas Murphy with iron pipes and wooden clubs for approximately 90 seconds, focusing their attack on his head and upper body, with a fury that suggested personal rather than random violence, and then fled up the stairs and disappeared into the morning crowds on the street above. Murphy died at the scene before ambulances arrived. The medical examiner counted 37 distinct impact wounds on his body, and noted in his report that the level of violence suggested extreme rage or planned retribution rather than typical street robbery. The second and third targets were 2 of Thomas Murphy's sons, Michael Murphy, age 23, and Patrick Murphy, age 19, both of whom had participated in Willie's abduction and murder. Michael worked as a delivery driver for a grocery store in Washington Heights. On the afternoon of August 16th, while making a delivery to an apartment building on St. Nicholas Avenue, he was confronted in a service hallway by 3 Negro men who beat him unconscious with baseball bats and then threw him down a flight of concrete stairs, breaking his neck and spine and killing him before building residents could summon help. Patrick Murphy, who worked nights as a security guard at a warehouse in the Bronx, was found dead on the morning of August 17th in an alley behind the warehouse, with his throat cut from ear to ear and his body bearing signs of having been beaten and tortured before his throat was slit. Police investigating both murders found no useful evidence and no witnesses willing to provide information beyond vague descriptions of Negro men seen in the vicinity of the crimes, and the pattern was becoming clear enough that white residents of Washington Heights began staying indoors after dark and varying their routines to avoid becoming the next target. The 4th and 5th targets were 2 neighbors of the Murphy family who had participated in Willie's killing, James Donnelly and Robert Sullivan, both of whom were members of Claver No. 7, and both of whom had bragged to fellow Klan members about teaching a Negro boy a permanent lesson about respecting racial boundaries. Donnelly, who worked as a bartender at an Irish pub on Broadway, was attacked on the evening of August 17th as he walked home from work along a street that was usually busy, but that happened to be temporarily empty due to a water main break that had closed the block to traffic. 3 Negro men approached him, and before Donnelly could react or call for help, one of the men shot him twice in the chest with a revolver at close range. Donnelly died at the scene, his blood pooling on the sidewalk while residents watched from windows but did not come outside to help. Sullivan, who worked as a clerk at a shipping company in Lower Manhattan, was more fortunate, or perhaps more alert, than his fellow Klan members. On the morning of August 18th, as he left his apartment building, he noticed 2 Negro men watching him from across the street with an intensity that made him immediately understand he was marked for death. Sullivan, recognizing that he was likely the next target in what had become a systematic campaign of retaliation, ran back into his building and called police. The two Negro men fled before officers arrived, and Sullivan spent the next week sleeping at friends' apartments throughout the city and varying his daily routine to avoid being ambushed, living in constant terror that eventually drove him to a psychological breaking point. The sixth target was not a person, but the meeting place of Clavern No. 7 itself. On the night of August 17th, while 17 Klan members were gathered in the basement of their meeting hall for their weekly assembly where they planned to discuss how to respond to the Negro violence that had killed 5 of their members, someone set fire to the building. The blaze started in multiple locations simultaneously on all 3 floors, suggesting careful planning and the use of multiple arsonists working in coordination, and it spread rapidly through the wooden structure that had been built in the 1890s and had never been updated with modern fire safety features. All 17 Klan members attending the meeting escaped through basement windows before the fire reached them, some of them suffering burns and smoke inhalation in the process, but the building was completely destroyed within 40 minutes. Along with Klan records membership lists, financial documents, regalia, and ritual materials that might have provided investigators with evidence about the organization's activities in New York City. Fire department investigators determined that the fire had been started using kerosene, the same accelerant that had been used to burn Willie Johnson, and that whoever set the fire had chosen a method that was clearly intended to send a symbolic message about reciprocal justice and eye-for-an-eye retribution. By the morning of August 18, 1923, 3 days after Willie Johnson's body had been discovered, the neighborhoods of Washington Heights and Harlem existed in a state of mutual terror and mounting violence. White residents of Washington Heights, many of whom had supported or tolerated Ku Klux Klan activity in their neighborhood because they viewed the organization as a defender of white racial purity and Protestant values against the encroachment of Negro Harlem, now feared that any of them could be targeted for violence by Negro avengers who seemed to strike without warning and without regard for whether their victims were actually guilty of participating in Willie's murder. The fact that 5 white men had been killed and a Klan meeting hall destroyed within 3 days created panic among white residents who began demanding increased police protection and who organized armed neighborhood patrols to watch for suspicious Negro men entering their streets. Negro residents of Harlem, while quietly proud that someone had finally struck back against the Klan's terrorism with overwhelming force, also feared that the violence would trigger massive white retaliation, or a police crackdown that would result in mass arrests of innocent people simply for being Negro and living in proximity to where the retaliatory attacks had occurred. New York. City police, caught between their institutional sympathy for the Klan and their professional obligation to maintain order and solve murders, launched investigations into the 5 white deaths, but made little progress because Negro Harlemites refused to cooperate with police inquiries, and because the attackers had been careful to avoid leaving evidence that could identify them. The situation escalated on August 18th, when federal investigators from the Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor agency to the FBI, arrived in New York City to examine the violence. The Bureau, which had been monitoring Ku Klux Klan activity throughout the country since 1921, due to concerns about domestic terrorism and civil disorder, had received reports that Klan members in New York had burned a Negro man alive in a manner identical to Southern lynchings, and that this act had triggered a wave of revenge killings that threatened to spark a full-scale race war in Upper Manhattan. Special Agent Daniel Webster, who led the federal investigation team of 4 agents dispatched from the Bureau's Washington headquarters, began interviewing witnesses, reviewing police reports, examining the burned building where Clavern No. 7 had met, and attempting to reconstruct the sequence of events that had started with Willie Johnson's death and led to the subsequent murders of 5 white men and the destruction of a Klan meeting hall. What Webster discovered during his investigation created a serious problem for federal law enforcement and for the Bureau's carefully maintained relationship with local police departments throughout the country. Webster's investigation revealed that Thomas Murphy and his accomplices had been members of an organized Klan Clavern that operated with at least tacit approval from local police, that several police officers in the Washington Heights precinct were themselves Klan members or sympathizers who attended Clavern meetings, that police had deliberately failed to investigate Willie Johnson's murder with any real intent to identify or arrest suspects, that the commanding officer of the precinct had explicitly ordered detectives to avoid pursuing leads that might implicate Klan members, and that the subsequent revenge killings had been carried out by a group of Negro criminals from Harlem who had acted with sophistication and planning that suggested they had access to detailed intelligence about their targets, movements, and routines. More troubling from the Bureau's perspective was evidence that suggested the Negro attackers had connections to organized crime figures in Harlem who controlled illegal gambling and other criminal enterprises, and who viewed the Klan's violence as a threat to the economic stability and social order of their neighborhood. Webster understood that pursuing this investigation to its logical conclusion would require the federal government to acknowledge that local police were protecting Klan terrorists, that Klan members had committed murder with impunity, that police officers had participated in covering up a lynching, and that the subsequent revenge killings, while illegal, had occurred only because legitimate law enforcement had failed to provide justice through legal channels. Webster also discovered something more personally disturbing during his investigation. Willie Johnson, the victim whose murder had triggered the cycle of violence, was the same Willie Johnson who had been sent north from Charleston in 1915 after being accused of killing a white man, an incident that had been documented in bureau files because Southern law enforcement had requested assistance in locating the fugitive. The bureau had declined to pursue the case at the time because there was no evidence that Willie had actually killed anyone, because the accusation appeared to be based on racial animosity rather than credible evidence. Now, 8 years later, Willie had died in New York in the same manner he would have died in Charleston if his parents had not sacrificed everything to save him. The symmetry was too perfect, the failure of law enforcement to complete, the message to clear. A Negro boy could not escape racial violence by fleeing from south to north because racial terrorism existed throughout America, protected by police and perpetrated by organizations like the Klan that operated openly in cities like New York with the knowledge and approval of law enforcement officials who shared their white supremacist ideology. On August 19th, Special Agent Webster met privately with senior officials from the New York City Police Department and with representatives from the New York State Attorney General's office. The meeting lasted 3 hours and was later described by one participant, an assistant state attorney general who took notes that were discovered decades later in archived files, as the most uncomfortable and morally compromising discussion he had ever witnessed involving federal and local law enforcement. Webster presented his findings in detail, providing evidence of police complicity in protecting Klan members, documenting the deliberate failure to investigate Willie Johnson's murder, showing financial records that suggested several police officers received payments from Klan members for providing protection and advance warning of investigations. He made clear that the Bureau had sufficient evidence to pursue federal civil rights charges against multiple police officers and to indict several Klan members for murder, kidnapping, and arson related to Willie's death. He also noted that the Negro revenge killings, while criminal, had been conducted with a level of organization and intelligence that suggested involvement by sophisticated criminal enterprises that the Bureau would normally be eager to investigate and dismantle. The local officials responded by arguing that federal intervention would inflame racial tensions that were already at a breaking point, that the Bureau did not understand the complex social dynamics of New York City neighborhoods where different ethnic and racial groups maintained uneasy coexistence through informal boundaries and mutual fear, and that the best approach would be to allow local authorities to handle the situation without outside interference that might trigger riots or broader violence. They pointed out that pursuing charges against police officers would undermine public confidence in law enforcement, that prosecuting Klan members would create a backlash among white residents who viewed the Klan as a legitimate fraternal organization, and that investigating the Negro revenge killings would require resources that could be better spent on other priorities. They proposed instead a compromise that would allow all parties to save face and avoid the political and legal complications that would result from a full public accounting of what had happened. Webster, who was under pressure from his superiors in Washington to resolve the matter quickly and quietly without creating a national scandal that would embarrass the Bureau and complicate its relationships with local police departments, found himself in an impossible position. He knew that the morally correct course of action was to pursue prosecutions against everyone involved, to expose police complicity in racial terrorism too, demonstrate that the federal government would not tolerate lynching whether it occurred in Mississippi or in New York. But he also understood the practical political realities, the resistance he would face from local authorities, the resources that would be required for prosecutions that might ultimately fail, because all-white juries would be unlikely to convict white defendants. For killing a Negro man or two, convict police officers for protecting Klan members. After consulting with his superiors by telephone, Webster ultimately agreed to a compromise that would prove deeply unsatisfying to everyone involved, but that would allow all parties to avoid the confrontation that full justice would have required. The compromise worked out during the August 19th meeting was simple in concept, but morally complex in its implications. The Bureau of Investigation would close its active investigation into the deaths of Thomas Murphy, Michael Murphy, Patrick Murphy, James Donnelly, and the unidentified fifth Klan member, accepting the New York City Police Department's position that these were local matters that did not require federal involvement and that would be handled through normal municipal investigative procedures. In exchange, the NYPD would quietly disband Clavern No. 7 and would pressure other Klan organizations operating in the city to cease public activities to stop recruiting new members, and to avoid any further violence against Negro residents that might trigger renewed federal attention. Additionally, the police would not pursue arrests of suspects in the 5 white deaths unless new evidence emerged that made such arrests unavoidable for public relations reasons, and would instead treat the murders as unsolved cases that would remain open but not actively investigated. Willie Johnson's death would officially remain unsolved as well, with police files noting that he had been killed by unknown assailants, possibly Klan members, but possibly other perpetrators, and that the investigation had produced no viable suspects or evidence sufficient to support prosecutions. The net effect of this compromise was that no one would be held legally accountable for any of the 6 deaths that had occurred between August 15th and August 17th, that the Klan would be allowed to continue existing in New York City, but with reduced visibility and constrained activities, that police officers who had protected Klan members and covered up Willie's murder would face no disciplinary action or criminal charges, and that the federal government would avoid having to confront the reality that racial terrorism was not a uniquely Southern phenomenon, but rather a national problem that extended into supposedly progressive northern cities where local law enforcement actively enabled white supremacist violence. The compromise also included an implicit understanding that Negro residents who had participated in the revenge killings would not be pursued by police as long as the violence stopped immediately, and as long as Harlem's criminal leadership agreed to maintain order and prevent further retaliation that might force authorities to act. Bumpy Johnson, who learned about the federal investigation and its resolution through contacts he had developed in Harlem's criminal community, understood that the compromise meant he would not be arrested for his role in organizing the revenge killings as long as he stopped the campaign of violence and returned to his normal activities. The message from law enforcement, delivered indirectly through intermediaries who moved between the criminal underworld and the police department, was clear and unambiguous. The authorities were willing to look the other way regarding what had happened during the 3 days following Willie's death, willing to pretend that the 5 white deaths were random acts of violence rather than coordinated retaliation, but only if the violence ended immediately and if Bumpy and his associates maintained a low profile and avoided any actions that might draw renewed federal attention or force authorities to pursue prosecutions they preferred to avoid. Bumpy accepted this arrangement not because he believed it represented justice for Willie's murder, not because he was satisfied with killing 5 men and destroying a Klan meeting hall, but because he recognized that continuing the violence would ultimately result in massive police retaliation that would harm innocent people in Harlem and would accomplish nothing beyond satisfying his own need for revenge. That could never truly be satisfied because Willie was dead and nothing could change that. The final casualty of the 3-day war occurred on August 20th, though this death was not directly attributable to violence by either side, but rather to the psychological toll that the events had taken on participants. Robert Sullivan, the 6th Klan member who had participated in Willie Johnson's murder and who had survived the initial wave of revenge attacks by going into hiding and varying his routines, hanged himself in a hotel room in the Bronx where he had been staying under an assumed name, paying cash daily to avoid creating records that might be traced. The suicide note he left made no specific mention of Willie Johnson or of the revenge killings, but police who investigated Sullivan's death noted that he had been drinking heavily for days, that he had told the hotel clerk that he could not sleep because of nightmares about being burned alive, and that he had written in his note that he could not live with the guilt of what he had done and the fear of what would be done to him. Whether Sullivan killed himself because of remorse over participating in burning a man alive, or because of terror that he would eventually be found and killed by Willie's avengers, the practical result was the same. 7 of the 8 men directly involved in Willie Johnson's murder were dead within 6 days of his killing, and the 8th man, whose identity was never definitively established by investigators, had fled New York City immediately after learning about the revenge killings and would never return. The events of August 1923 became part of Harlem's oral history and part of the legend that would grow around Bumpy Johnson over the subsequent decades, as he rose to become the most powerful crime boss in the neighborhood. The story that was told and retold in barbershops and pool halls and street corners throughout Harlem emphasized several key elements that made it more than just another tale of criminal violence. Willie Johnson had been the same boy who was sent north in 1915 to escape lynching in Charleston, the boy whose parents had mortgaged their home and sacrificed their financial security to save him from racial violence. He had lived in New York for 8 years, had built a decent life, working legitimate jobs, had survived and prospered in the North, only to die in 1923 in the same manner he would have died in 1915 if his parents had not saved him. The police had done nothing to investigate or punish the killers, despite clear evidence of Klan involvement. Bumpy Johnson, only 18 years old, but already possessing the strategic mind and capacity for organized violence that would later make him legendary, had organized and executed a revenge campaign that left 7 white men dead in 6 days, 5 of them killed through coordinated attacks that demonstrated careful planning and intelligence gathering, 2 of them dead from suicide or psychological collapse caused by terror of being the next target. The federal government had investigated, discovered police complicity in protecting the Klan and covering up Willie's murder, and had chosen to close its files and walk away rather than confront the systemic racism of New York City law enforcement and the uncomfortable reality that lynching was not a uniquely Southern phenomenon. The long-term consequences of the August 1923 violence extended beyond the immediate deaths and beyond the specific individuals involved. Claver No. 7 of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan never reconstituted after its meeting hall was destroyed, and 7 of its members were killed or driven to suicide. Several other Klan chapters in New York City quietly dissolved or drastically reduced their activities in the months following the incident. And while the Klan continued to exist in New York through the mid-1920s, with chapters in other boroughs and in upstate areas, its public profile in Manhattan diminished significantly. The organization's ability to operate openly was constrained by the fear that violence against Negro residents might trigger retaliation that local police would be unwilling or unable to prevent, and by the recognition that federal investigators might become involved if Klan violence created sufficient publicity or threatened broader civil disorder. The compromise worked out between federal investigators and local law enforcement established a troubling precedent, whereby racial violence would be addressed through informal arrangements and tacit agreements rather than through formal legal processes, but it also demonstrated that Negro communities were not powerless, that organized violent resistance could achieve results that legal appeals and political advocacy could not, and that white supremacist terrorists could be made to pay a price for their actions, even when legitimate legal systems refused to provide justice. For Bumpy Johnson, personally, the events of August 1923 established his reputation as someone who would respond to injustice with overwhelming force, who possessed the intelligence and connections to orchestrate complex violent operations without getting caught, and who valued loyalty to family and community above his own safety or freedom. William Hewlett, his employer and mentor in Harlem's criminal underworld, promoted him to a position of greater responsibility within the organization, and began training him in the more sophisticated aspects of running illegal gambling operations and managing relationships with corrupt police officers and politicians, who could be bought or intimidated. The skills Bumpy developed during this period, the network of contacts he built, the reputation for ruthless efficiency he earned, all of these would serve him well over the subsequent decades as he rose to become the dominant figure in Harlem's organized crime community, eventually replacing Hewlett and becoming the primary Negro intermediary with Italian mob families who controlled much of New York's criminal economy. His willingness to use violence strategically rather than impulsively, his ability to plan operations that achieved their objectives, while leaving minimal evidence, and his understanding that power came not just from physical force, but from intelligence and connections and the willingness to act when others hesitated. All of these characteristics that would define his later career were demonstrated. During those 3 days, in August 1923, when he avenged his brother's murder, Willie Johnson was buried on August 23, 1923, in a cemetery in the Bronx, next to the plot that had been reserved for their parents. When they eventually died, a small family grouping that would never be complete because Mr. and Mrs. Johnson remained in Charleston, unable to afford the trip north for their son's funeral. The service was attended by more than 400 people, most of them Negro Harlemites, who had never met Willie, but who came to pay respects to a young man who had been murdered for the crime of being black in America and who had become a symbol of the racial terrorism that continued to plague the country, even in supposedly progressive northern cities. Bumpy Johnson did not speak at the funeral. He stood silently at the graveside wearing the same black suit Willie had been wearing when he went to visit Catherine Murphy, a suit that had been recovered from Willie's apartment, and that fit Bumpy reasonably well, despite his brother having been taller and broader. Those who knew Bumpy well later reported that he showed no outward emotion during the service, that his face remained completely impassive as the minister spoke about Willie's life and the tragedy of his death, that he did not cry when the casket was lowered into the ground. But later that night, alone in Willie's apartment, surrounded by his brother's possessions, Bumpy was heard by neighbors, screaming and destroying furniture, smashing everything. Willie had owned tearing apart the small life his brother had built over 8 years in New York. In the years that followed, Bumpy would occasionally mention Willie when talking to close associates about why he had chosen a life of crime rather than attempting to work within legitimate society structures, the system that allowed white men to burn a Negro alive for visiting a white neighborhood and face no legal consequences, the police who protected racial terrorists rather than investigating their crimes and who actively covered up lynchings to protect Klan members, the federal government that chose political convenience over justice and that walked away from evidence of police complicity in murder rather than confront systemic racism. All of these failures of legitimate authority demonstrated to Bumpy that power and respect and safety in America came not through legal channels, but through force and through the willingness to use violence when violence was the only language that one's enemies understood. Willie had tried to live legitimately, had worked honest jobs for 8 years, had followed all the rules that Negro people were told to follow if they wanted to be safe and successful, and Willie had died screaming for his little brother to save him, while Klan members burned him alive 2 miles from where Bumpy slept. Too far away to hear, too far away to help. The Ku Klux Klan in New York City continued to decline throughout the late 1920s, damaged by negative publicity, internal corruption, leadership scandals, and the effects of the Great Depression, which eliminated the economic resources that had sustained the organization's expansion. By 1930, the Klan's presence in New York was minimal, and by 1940, it had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force in the city, though individual members and former members remained, scattered throughout the population, carrying their racist ideology into other contexts and organizations. Whether the events of August 1923 contributed significantly to this decline is difficult to determine with certainty, given the multiple factors that weakened the Klan nationally during this period. But there is no doubt that Klan members in New York understood after those 3 days that racial terrorism against Negro residents carried risks that had not existed before, that retaliation could be swift and lethal and impossible to prevent, that neither the police nor the federal government could be counted on to protect white supremacists from the consequences of their actions, and that burning a Negro man alive might result in 7 white deaths and the destruction of an entire clavern within a week. The 7 white men who died in August 1923 became cautionary examples within white supremacist circles, proof that the Negro population was not passive, that some Negro criminals possessed the capability and the will to strike back with devastating effect, and that the racial terrorism that had operated with impunity in the South might encounter armed resistance in northern cities where Negro communities had resources and organization that their southern counterparts lacked. The Bureau of Investigation's decision to close its files on the August 1923 Violence without pursuing prosecutions represented one of many compromises that federal law enforcement made during the 1920s, when confronted with racial violence that implicated local police or politically connected white supremacist organizations. These compromises, while expedient in the short term, and while avoiding immediate confrontations that might have been difficult or impossible, to winning the political and legal climate of the era, contributed to a broader pattern whereby racial terrorism was normalized, whereby Negro communities learned that they could not rely on legal institutions to provide protection or justice, and whereby the message was sent repeatedly that white lives mattered more than black lives in the eyes of law enforcement and government. The fact that Bumpy Johnson's revenge campaign achieved more tangible results in 3 days than years of legal advocacy and political pressure had achieved. The fact that 7 dead white men in a burned Klan meeting hall accomplished what official investigations and prosecutions could not or would not accomplish was not lost on Harlem's residents. The story of those 3 days would be remembered long after the specific details of individual deaths had faded from memory. Remembered as proof that some forms of justice existed outside the law. That power could flow from the barrel of a gun when it would not flow from a courtroom, and that federal investigators would walk away when confronting truth became too uncomfortable or too politically costly. Bumpy Johnson lived another 45 years after August 1923, dying of a heart attack in 1968, at the age of 62 while eating breakfast at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. Throughout those decades, the story of what happened when the Klan burned his brother Willie alive remained part of his legend, perhaps the most important part, the story that explained everything else about who he became and why he operated the way he did. It was a story that demonstrated both his capacity for ruthless violence and his willingness to risk everything to avenge family and to defend the dignity of Negro people against white supremacist terrorism. The story was told to explain why Bumpy commanded such respect and fear in Harlem, why even police officers who theoretically had the authority to arrest him often chose to negotiate with him rather than confront him directly, why rival criminals understood that attacking Bumpy or anyone connected to him would trigger retaliation that would be systematic and brutal and impossible to escape. 7 white men had learned that lesson in August 1923, and their deaths had sent a message that echoed through Harlem for generations, a message about the limits of white supremacy in neighborhoods where Negro people had the organization and resources to fight back, about the price of racial terrorism when the victims refused to be passive, and about what happened when federal investigators chose political convenience over justice and walked away from truth because truth was too dangerous to confront.